Well, tonight, the two co-founders of Google resigned from their executive posts this week. It's happening as the U.S. is threatening to ban Huawei for its ties to the Chinese government. But get this, Google has troubling ties to our government, specifically Pentagon, CIA, NSA. For more on this, here is our special news correspondent, Michelle Greenstein, following this. So Google and the U.S. government, huh?
That's right. I mean, as of yesterday, Larry Page and Sergey Brin announced that they were leaving their roles as Alphabet's CEO and president. However, they will still retain a majority of the company's voting shares and thus their control over the board. But I'm glad you brought up the relationship between Google and the state, because this is a relationship that goes back all the way into the early 2000s, if not earlier. As one example, this year, Google spent $21 million lobbying the U.S. government, but that's perhaps the most overt example of this relationship. And the real relationship is actually more covert. In 2003, Google got its first NSA and first CIA contract that we know of. Additionally, Google also was contracted to design the intelligence system that helped target people in Iraq in so-called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Another, even more glaring example is that a spy satellite that's actually hovering above us as we speak was actually designed by Google, and now Google is the sole provider of the NGA, which is an NSA sister organization for satellite intelligence software. They essentially created a Google Earth for the military through this $27 million contract, and what you just saw there was the Google logo on this this missile that launched that satellite into space. Yes, so Google is, in a way, it's been said that Google is the eyes of the U.S. military machine. And more recently, and perhaps more controversially, this case is a little bit more well-known. In 2017, Google was contracted for something called Project Maven, which was the Pentagon's attempt to make their drones a little bit more autonomous. So it's one of the contractors that actually gave AI to the U.S. drone program and helps the U.S. government target people for assassinations. About a dozen employees actually resigned over that issue, but I think that really speaks to the unknown origins of Google as this entity with a very big relationship with the state. The fact that it was so controversial that Google employees said, we don't want to be a part of this, we don't want to resign, but really that relationship really does go back decades.
But how ironic is this, that just this week the U.S. government was talking about China and accusing China of doing this very same thing with Huawei.
By having a relationship with the state, that is what they're accusing it of. They're saying that Huawei is, being used by the Chinese state to spy on people, right? But not only does Google have a relationship, but Google's origins actually go back to the military. This was a time when the intelligence community was predicting that people would move together online and aim to track and identify those people. So when Google was launched in 1998, this is what the intelligence community was seeking to do. So Google was actually born out of NSA and CIA research grants for mass surveillance. In fact, Sergey Brin, one of those co-founders that just transitioned out of his role, reported directly to representatives of the intelligence community during the development of Google, because of course the intelligence community saw this great company as a way to have a network where people could be tracked, so that groups and people who may pose a threat to what, who knows, that's the question, right, could be identified and tracked before they did so. But before they did harm to what, right? Many would say to the status quo, or in this case, to the U.S. government. In fact, the internet itself was actually created by the Pentagon. This is something that you and I have reported on in the past as a counterinsurgency tool. And as the internet began to be privatized in the 80s and 90s, the U.S. government actually seeded a lot of these companies. So Google is one example. Google was seeded by the Pentagon. It came into being by a Pentagon grant. And actually, Sergey Brin mentions DARPA's, the Pentagon's DARPA program in one of his original Stanford papers.
It seems like another reason why we ask all the times whether some of these very big tech companies shouldn't really be broken up into smaller parts like we've done in the past with Standard Oil and other huge megalopolis, huge monopolies, I should say.
I mean, this has a lot to do with the monopoly that Google has over many things, but of one thing, over the search engine market. In fact, this has become such a vast monopoly that Eric Schmidt, the former CEO and still current board member to this day, even said, quote, about Google's power. He said, we actually don't need you to type at all. We know where you are, we know where you've been, and we can know more or less what you're thinking about. So I want to give you a little bit of a taste of the monopoly that Google actually has over the search engine market. Let's take a look. As of right now, or actually as of recently, of November 2019, 88.5% of U.S. citizens are just using Google as their search engine. And it's not just the search engine market monopolization, it's also things like YouTube, which has 2 billion monthly users, Gmail, which has 1 billion active users. And I think journalist and author Yasha Levine put it really well when he said that Google isn't just connected to the internet, Google is the internet. And of course, all of this data that Google has, we have to put it into the broader context, right, of, this geopolitical world, where having all this data where you can track and monitor people, it's really not just surveillance for surveillance sake, but we can then look at the implications that Google and, as an extension, the U.S. government may have over control, whether that's of how we think of certain things or actually whether or not we are able to consider certain items as well.
That's a very important question. What do they know that we know? Michelle Greenstein, good work. Thank you. Good report.